There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house after a child has fallen asleep mid-sentence. A toy still in their hand, the day's adventures unfinished but somehow impossibly complete. That stillness carries something in it, half wonder, half ache, the kind of feeling that doesn't announce itself but stays with you long after the lights go off. That's where this one begins. Welcome to the Cineflux. If you found your way here, there's a good chance you already know what it feels like to sit through the credits of a film and not move. Not because you're waiting for a post credit scene, but because something inside you is still catching up to what it just witnessed. That feeling, that lingering unresolved hum, is the entire reason this channel exists. We don't do reviews in the conventional sense. We sit with films. We let them breathe a little longer than they're usually given. We ask not just whether something worked, but what it was reaching for and what it cost to reach for it. Today, we're sitting with something that carries a strange kind of weight before a single frame even plays. Toy Story 5, a title that on paper might make you brace yourself a little. Franchise fatigue is real and you felt it. The sequel that didn't need to exist, the universe expanded one installment past its natural ending, and Toy Story already had an ending. A real one. Toy Story 3 gave Andy's toys to Bonnie in a scene that even now, over a decade later, is shorthand for the moment that destroyed me in a movie theater. Toy Story 4 gave Woody his own quiet, hard-won goodbye, a choice to walk away from the only purpose he'd ever known, towards something less certain but more honestly his. That felt to a lot of people like the actual end, the kind of ending you don't revisit, because revisiting it would mean unmaking it. So here's the question this essay sits inside of: what do you do with a story that already said goodbye and then asks you to come back? That question matters more this time because of what this film is actually about. Underneath the talking toys and the chase sequences and the inevitable Pixar gut punch. And yes, there is reportedly a gut punch. Toy Story 5 is about something achingly contemporary. It's about a child whose favorite thing in the room is no longer a toy at all, but a screen. A tablet specifically is something endlessly responsive, endlessly patient, endlessly there in a way that an old cowboy doll or a space ranger action figure simply cannot compete with. And the toys, the ones who spent 30 years teaching us what loyalty and purpose and being chosen actually feel like, now have to face the possibility of not being chosen at all. Think about what that means for a moment. Not as a plot mechanic, but as a feeling. Because somewhere in your life there was a thing you loved with your whole chest as a kid. A toy, a show, a ritual that quietly stopped being the thing. Not because anyone took it from you, just because something else arrived that was easier to love, in a smaller, faster way. And one day you looked up and realized you couldn't actually remember the last time you'd held it. This film, it seems, is trying to sit inside that exact moment, the moment of becoming optional, and ask what a person or a toy or a childhood does with that. Does it fight to stay relevant? Does it let go with grace? Is there even a difference between the two? What I want to do with you today is take this film seriously as a piece of cinema, not just as the fifth entry in a beloved series, but as a work being made right now by people responding to right now. We are going to look at the culture this film is breathing as it arrives. We are going to talk about what it's trying to say about screens and childhood and attention, themes that feel less like a kid's movie premise and more like something you'd find yourself discussing at 2 in the morning with someone you trust. We're going to walk through the emotional architecture of this story, the choices its characters make and why, the silences the camera holds and what they're carrying. And later, once we've earned it, once we've sat with the film on its own terms first, we'll go into everything. Every turn, every ending, every detail that only makes sense looking backward. But not it. Not until we've given this film the same thing it seems to be asking its characters to give each other, real attention, without rushing toward the next thing. Here is the thing about this film before we've even properly met it. It's arriving at a strange and oddly perfect moment. 30 years since the first Toy Story changed what animation could be. 7 years since the last one said its goodbye. And right now, in a world more saturated with screens than it has ever been, a story about toys competing with a tablet for a child's attention isn't just timely. It might be the most honest mirror this franchise has ever held up. So let's start there, not inside the film yet, but outside it, in the world that made this story necessary in the first place. 30 years ago, the Arjun Toy Story didn't just introduce Woody and Buzz, it introduced a whole new way of making films. First Stop, the first entirely computer animated feature, a technological leap that at the time felt almost as disruptive as anything inside its own story. There's something quietly poetic about that if you sit with it. The franchise that taught generations of kids about loyalty, obsolescence, and what it means to be replaced by something newer and shinier was itself born from a moment of massive technological replacement, hand drawn animation giving way to something built entirely inside a computer. Pixar has always, in some sense, been telling stories about its own anxieties, and now, 3 decades later, the toys are facing their own Buzz Lightyear moment. Except this time the new arrival isn't a flashier action figure with a laser and a catchphrase. It's a tablet, a genuinely well designed, endlessly patient, infinitely available frog shaped piece of technology named Lilypad, voiced by Greta Lee, and according to early reporting, she isn't framed as a cartoon villain twirling a mustache. She's something far more uncomfortable, a competitor who is good at her job. Disney and Pixar's own marketing aims into this directly with the tagline Toy Meets Tech. And if that phrase makes something in your chest tighten a little, that's probably the point. Here's what this film does that I think is genuinely rare, and it's worth pausing on before we go any further. It doesn't have to invent a metaphor for its central anxiety, it just has to look around. Anywhere you go right now, restaurants, waiting rooms, car rides, bedtime, there's a version of this exact tension playing out in real life. A child reaching for a screen instead of a toy instinctively, the way you might reach for your phone the second a conversation goes quiet. Parents have been having this conversation for years now in pediatricians' offices and parenting forums and quiet, guilty moments of their own. What does it mean when the most emotionally responsive presence in a child's life might be an algorithm? Toy Story 5 isn't asking that question in the abstract. It's asking it through characters that an entire generation grew up loving, which is either the gentlest possible way to ask a hard question or the most devastating one. Possibly both. Cinema, more broadly, is having its own version of this conversation right now. 1326 is a year thick with anxiety about artificial intelligence, not just as a plot device, but as a force actively reshaping how films get made, who gets to make them, and what audiences are willing to trust. Animation studios, Pixar very much included, exist inside that conversation, whether they want to or not. So there's a layer of dramatic irony sitting quietly underneath this entire film, a story about whether something handcrafted and emotionally lived in can hold its ground against something faster and more efficient, made by a studio that is, in its own industry, fighting a very similar battle for relevance and trust. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's the entire reason this story exists right now, and not 5 years ago, and not 5 years from now. There's also the matter of timing within the franchise itself, and this is where things get emotionally complicated in a way that's worth sitting with. Toy Story 3 gave us an ending that, for a lot of people, felt complete in the truest sense. Andy handing his toys to Bonnie, growing up, letting go, all of it scored with a kind of devastating restraint that made grown adults cry in actual movie theaters. Toy Story 4 then gave Woody his own ending, a quieter and more personal one, choosing a life of purpose outside the toy box entirely. Two endings in 7 years. And now, a fifth film, arriving into a cultural moment that's already a little wary of franchises that don't know when to stop what starting, and this is where the premiere reactions become genuinely interesting, is how directly that wariness seems to have been met. The film had its world premiere on June 9th in Los Angeles, and early reactions that came out of that screening weren't just positive in the way premiere reactions tend to be. They were specific in a way that suggests people walked in braced for something unnecessary and walked out feeling like they'd witnessed something the franchise actually needed. One critic called it a wonderfully heartfelt return to form. Another called it magical and pure perfection, specifically praising the way the story finally centers Jessie, a character who's been part of this world since Toy Story 2, always rich with unresolved history, but never quite given the narrative weight she's carried emotionally. There's a recurring idea in these early reactions that this isn't Woody's story or even Buzz's, it's hers. And several people who've seen it are already saying that shift alone justifies the film's existence. Here is what I keep returning to, though when I read through these reactions, more than one person mentioned that the film's opening stretch feels a little scattered, multiple storylines being set up simultaneously before everything converges into what's being described almost unanimously as a third act that delivers everything you'd want from this franchise at its best. That structure is interesting in itself. A film about fractured attention, about a household splitting its focus between old toys and new technology that itself asks you to hold several threads at once before they resolve. Whether that's intentional formatting or just how the story naturally unfolded, it's the kind of detail that tends to reward a second viewing, and we'll come back to it. There's also Taylor Swift's involvement, which arrived almost as its own cultural event. Her original song for the film, I Knew It, I Knew You, wasn't even confirmed until June 1st, just over a week before the premiere, and she showed up to perform it live alongside Randy Newman, the composer who has scored every Toy Story film since 1995. That's not a small detail. Newman's music has been the emotional backbone of this franchise for 3 decades, and pairing him with one of the most culturally dominant artists of this era on a song that's already being talked about as a serious Best Original Song contender says something about how this film is positioning itself not just as a sequel but as an event. Odd season conversations are already circling it, and full critic reviews haven't even been published yet. They're still under embargo as I write this, set to lift just days before the film opens. Which means, in a strange way, this essay sits in a kind of in between space, early enough that the wider critical consensus hasn't fully formed, late enough that the people who've seen it are already using words like generation defining. So, is this a film that feels timeless or perfectly of its time? Here's the thing about that question. I think it's both, and I think that's actually the most Pixar thing about it. Wally used a near silent robot to talk about consumerism and environmental collapse in ways that still feel urgent, almost 2 decades later. Inside Out used the inner architecture of a child's mind to talk about emotional development in ways that therapists now actually reference. Pixar's best films have always taken something specific to their moment and found a timeless ache underneath it. A tablet shaped like a frog is, on the surface, an extremely 2026 image, playful, slightly absurd, unmistakably tied to this exact cultural anxiety about screens and children. But underneath that image is a feeling that has nothing to do with technology at all. It's the feeling of becoming someone's second choice, of loving someone who's moved on to something easier and having to decide what to do with that love when it's no longer being returned in the same way. That feeling isn't new. It isn't tied to tablets or to 2026 or to any specific piece of technology at all. It's as old as growing up. What this film understands, or at least what it seems to understand based on everything circling around it right now, is that the most effective way to talk about something as huge and abstract as our relationship with technology is to make it small, to make it personal, to put it inside a cowgirl doll who spent 30 years learning what it means to be loved, and then ask her to watch a child fall in love with something else. And that's the world this film is stepping into. A world 30 years removed from its own beginning, 7 years removed from what felt like its ending, and right in the middle of a cultural moment that's anxious, distracted, and maybe, if these early reactions are anything to go by, quietly hungry for a story that takes that anxiety seriously without making it feel hopeless. Which brings us finally to the film itself. Toy Story 5 is the 31st feature film from Pixar Animation Studios and the fifth entry in the franchise that, in many ways, built the studio's identity from the ground up. It opens in theaters on June 19th, 2026, under Walt Disney Pictures, and on paper, it carries all the genre markers you'd expect: animation, adventure, comedy, the kind of family film built to play equally well to a 6-year-old and the parent sitting next to them. But genre labels have always undersold what this franchise actually does, and there's no reason to think that's changed here. What's genuinely notable, before we even get to story, is who's sitting in the director's chair. Andrew Stanton has been part of this franchise's DNA since the very beginning. He co-wrote all four previous Toy Story films, shaping the voice and emotional logic of this world for 3 decades. But this is the first time he's directed one. In the years since, Stanton went on to direct Finding Nemo, Wall-E, and Finding Dory, films that share a very particular sensibility. Stories about characters who get separated from the world they know and who have to figure out not just how to get back, but who they are once they do. That's not a small detail to bring back to this franchise. A filmmaker who spent 20 years writing this world, then went off and built an entire career out of stories about displacement and rediscovery, is now returning to direct the story himself. He co-wrote the screenplay with Makina Harris, who also co-directs, from a story credited to Stanton alone, and Lindsay Collins, a longtime Pixar producer with deep roots in this franchise, produced it. And then there's Randy Newman, whose name might be the single most consistent thread running through this entire series. He has scored every Toy Story film since 1995, which means the music that's about to play under the story is, in a very literal sense, the same musical voice that's been with these characters since the beginning. There's something quietly moving about that continuity existing at all in 2026 in an industry where almost nothing stays the same for 30 years. The sound of this world has. The world itself, as the title suggests, is the world we already know. Bonnie's room, the toy box, the rules of this universe where toys come alive the moment humans aren't looking. But the texture of that world has shifted. The film picks up roughly 2 years after the quiet, bittersweet reunion that closed out Toy Story 4, Woody finding his way back to Bo Peep, choosing a different kind of purpose outside the toy box entirely. That choice has consequences here. Reportedly, Woody is no longer living full time with the rest of the toys. He's out in the world, staying connected through walkie talkies, continuing the work he's always cared about most: helping toys without a home find one. Which means that for the first time in this franchise's history, the central group dynamic doesn't automatically revolve around him. Instead, that role falls to Jessie. And this is, I think, the detail that matters most when you're trying to understand what kind of story this actually is. Jessie has always carried more unspoken history than almost any other character in this world. Her introduction in Toy Story 2 gave us one of the most quietly devastating sequences in the entire franchise, a backstory about abandonment that the films have circled back to again and again without ever fully resolving. Now, with Buzz stepping into the role of her second in command, the group's center of gravity shifts toward a character who has spent 30 years processing what it feels like to stop being someone's favorite. Sit with that for a second, because it's not subtle, and I don't think it's meant to be. The toy who knows exactly what it feels like to be replaced is now the one leading the others through the fear of being replaced again. Bonnie herself has grown. She's around 8 now, played by a new young actress, and her attention has shifted toward Lilypad, the tablet that's become the film's central source of tension. The returning voice cast reads like a reunion in the best sense. Tom Hanks as Woody, Tim Allen as Buzz, Joan Cusack as Jessie, alongside familiar faces like John Ratzenberger and Wallace Shawn, who voiced their characters since the very first film. New additions bring their own gravity. Greta Lee voicing Lilybud with what's reportedly a surprisingly layered performance. Conan O'Brien introducing a new character named Smarty Pants that early reactions have already singled out as an instant standout, and even a brief imagination sequence cameo from Alan Cumming as Bullseye. There's a looseness and generosity to a cast list like that, the sense of a world still expanding, still finding room for new voices without losing the old ones. So, what kind of story is this at its heart? Strip away the toy box mechanics, the chase sequences, the inevitable rescue missions, And what you're left with is a story about a group of people who have built their entire sense of purpose around being loved by one specific person, watching that person's attention drift towards something new, and having to decide what they do with themselves when they're not needed in quite the same way anymore. That's it. That's the engine. Everything else, the tablet, the technology, the toy meets tech framing, is the vehicle for that feeling, not the feeling itself. And if that sounds like it could describe almost anyone's experience of growing older, watching relationships shift, watching the things that once defined you quietly become optional, that's not an accident. This film does something rare in how directly it lets a children's story carry an adult's ache without ever talking down to either audience. As for whether you should watch it, and I'll keep this part genuinely spoiler free because some things really do deserve to be experienced cold. Everything pointing out of that premiere suggests this is a film worth carving out time for and worth watching with people you care about. Not because it's simply good in the flattened way that word gets used, but because it seems to be asking something real of you. It's asking you to think about what you've outgrown, what you've held on to, and what it might mean to let something go without treating that as a failure. If you grew up with these characters, if Toy Story 3's ending left a mark on you that never quite faded, there's a good chance this film is going to find that mark again. And if you're coming to this world fresh, through a child's eyes rather than your own childhood, I suspect it'll still land, just from a different angle. This film does something rare in how it trusts its audience, all of its audiences, at once, to sit with a question that doesn't have an easy answer. And before we go any further into what that question actually feels like from the inside, I want to take you back to the first time I sat with this film myself. Because the experience of watching it begin before you know where it's headed, before the third act everyone's been talking about even arrives, is its own kind of story. There's a specific kind of silence that exists only in the seconds before a Pixar film starts, not the silence of an empty theater, but the silence of a full one, right after the lights go down and right before the logo appears. You can feel people settling into themselves, phones disappearing, a kind of collective exhale like everyone in the room is quietly agreeing to be somewhere else for the next 2 hours. I want to be honest with you about something before I tell you what this film felt like. I went in carrying more weight than I expected to. Part of that weight was personal. I think most people who grew up with this franchise carry a small, specific wound from Toy Story 3, the kind of wound that doesn't really heal so much as it just stops being touched. And Toy Story 4, for all its quiet grace, reopened that wound just enough to remind you it was still there. So, walking into a fifth film after two endings that both genuinely felt like endings, there's a particular bracing that happens. Not dread exactly. More like the feeling of opening a door to a room you used to live in, not sure what's being moved around since you left. And then there was the other kind of weight, the cultural kind. Every conversation I'd had about this film in the days leading up to it had circled the same idea: toys versus tech, a tablet as the new rival for a child's attention. Pixar taking direct aim at something every parent in that theater was almost certainly thinking about in relation to their own kid, sitting 2 seats away with a screen already glowing in their hands. There's a strange vulnerability in watching a film that seems to know exactly what's in your pocket. What struck me most, though, before the story had even really started, was how familiar the world felt. The opening stretch settles you back into Bonnie's room with the kind of confidence that only comes from a studio that spent 30 years building this universe brick by brick. The light in that room has always had a particular quality to it: warm, slightly golden, the kind of light that makes ordinary plastic toys look like they're holding their breath. That light is still there. The toy box still has that lived in clutter, the specific chaos of a child's belongings that somehow always reads as cozy rather than messy. If you've spent any time in this world before, the film doesn't ask you to relearn it. It just opens the door and lets you walk back in. But almost immediately, something feels different, and I don't mean different in a bad way, just different in a way that takes a moment to register. Woody isn't there in the way he's always been there. You can feel his absence in the room the way you'd feel a missing piece of furniture. Not dramatically, just as a kind of negative space. The walkie talkie sitting somewhere in that room. The idea that he's out there somewhere, still part of this world, but not part of this room anymore, gives the opening stretch a texture I wasn't quite prepared for. It's not sad, not yet, but it's quiet in a way that previous openings haven't been. And then there's the tablet. I won't get into specifics here, that's for later, but I will say this. The film doesn't introduce Lilypad as a threat in the way you might expect from the marketing. There's no ominous shadow, no villain coded entrance. If anything, the unsettling part is how unthreatening it feels at first. It's just there, bright, responsive, present in the way a phone is present on a table during dinner, not doing anything wrong, just existing in a way that quietly reorganizes the room around it. I found myself thinking about my own house, about how many times I've watched a kid's attention get pulled toward a screen, not because anyone did anything dramatic, but just because the screen was simply better at holding attention than anything else in the room. That recognition, that quiet, slightly uncomfortable recognition, set in before the story had even properly begun, and it stayed with me for the rest of the film. When I first sat with this film, I expected to be moved eventually. That's almost a given with this franchise at this point, but I didn't expect to feel something this early. I expected the emotional rage to arrive later, earned through plot, through the usual Pixar architecture of setup and payoff. Instead, it arrived almost immediately, just from atmosphere, from light and silence and absence, from a room that looked the same but felt different in a way I couldn't fully name yet. There's a looseness to the early stretch that I think is worth mentioning, because more than one person coming out of the premiere described the opening as feeling a little scattered. Multiple threads being introduced at once, multiple characters given their own small moments before the story really locks into its shape. Sitting there, I understood what they meant. It does take a little while to find its footing. But I also found myself wondering, even in that early stretch, whether that looseness was doing something on purpose. A household where attention is divided, where the toys are no longer the singular focus of a child's world, opening with a story structure that itself feels divided, that asks you to hold several things in your head before they resolve into a single shape. I don't know yet whether that's intentional. But I noticed it, and noticing it changed how I watched everything that came after. What I came in expecting more than anything was a film about a villain, a new threat dispatched by the third act, status quo restored. What I got even in those first quiet minutes felt like something else entirely, something closer to a mood than a plot, a feeling of overt adjusting to a new gravity, a feeling of characters I've known for 30 years standing in a room that used to be entirely theirs, watching something new occupy the corner of it, and not yet knowing whether that's a tragedy or just what growing up actually looks like for toys and for everyone else. That feeling, uncertain, a little melancholy, not yet sad, but standing right at the edge of it, is where the film picks me up and carries me into everything that happens next. And what happens next is where this essay needs to slow down and really walk through it with you, not as a list of events, but as something closer to what it actually felt like to live through, scene by scene, choice by choice, because that's where this film starts asking its real questions. I want to be careful with though this part because there's a difference between telling you what happens in a film and telling you what it feels like while it's happening to you. A synopsis is something you forget on the drive home. An experience is something that rearranges a little bit of how you see your own life for the rest of the night. So, what follows isn't a list of plot points, it's closer to a memory, the memory of sitting in a dark room and feeling a story unfold around you, scene by scene, before you had any distance from it. The film doesn't ease you in gently, and that itself feels like a choice. From what's been shown in early footage, the opening isn't Bonnie's room at all, not at first. It's somewhere else entirely. A first person shot, the camera looking out through the eyes of a Buzz Lightyear figure, waking up on what appears to be a deserted island. It's a direct echo of how the very first Toy Story opened, all those years ago, that same sense of waking into a world that doesn't quite make sense yet. Except this time the Buzz waking up isn't alone. He's surrounded by dozens of other Buzzes, all of them outfitted with smart glowing screens, all of them still locked in toy mode, all of them trying with complete sincerity to re-establish contact with Star Command. Sit with that image for a second because I think it's doing more than setting a tone. These are commemorative figures, mass produced, identical, each one carrying the same program purpose, none of them aware that the purpose was ever just packaging. And from what's been described, the sequence builds toward something almost ceremonial, a kind of campfire scene under the night sky. All these identical toys chanting Star Command together, half mournful and half absurd. There's something genuinely haunting about that, if you let it sit. A whole island of toys, all running the same loop, all calling out to a command structure that was never real to begin with, all glowing faintly in the dark like they're keeping a vigil for something that doesn't exist. It's funny, on its surface, Pixar has never lost its sense of humor. But underneath the humor, it's a portrait of obsolescence taken to its most literal extreme. Toys stuck in their factory setting on a forgotten island, still doing the only thing they were ever programmed to do, with no one left to do it for. And then the fin does what it's always done best. It takes that big, strange, almost mythic image and brings it back down to something small and domestic. We're in Bonnie's room. The light is the light we talked about before, warm, familiar, golden. And dead in the middle of that familiar warmth is the thing this whole film has been building toward. Lilypad. Here's what struck me about how she's introduced. Based on everything that circled out of the trailers and the premiere, she isn't loud, she isn't aggressive. She's a tablet, frog shaped, bright eyed, genuinely charming in the way that good design is charming, and Bonnie likes her. Not in a brainwashed, sinister way, just in the simple, unremarkable way a kid likes something fun and responsive and new. That's the choice that makes this whole film work, I think. If Lilliput had been written as obviously bad, manipulative, cruel, easy to root against, this would be a much smaller story. Instead, she's described as playfully antagonistic, which is a strange phrase to sit with. Antagonistic towards the toys, sure, but not toward Bonnie. Toward Bonnie, she's just good at her job. And that's the thing the toys can't compete with and can't even really be angry at because there's nothing to be angry at. You can't out argue a thing that's simply better at being fun. This is where Jessie's role becomes the emotional center of gravity, and I don't think that's an accident of marketing. I think it's the entire structural decision the film is built around. Jessie has spent this entire franchise as the character who knows in her body what it feels like to stop being chosen. Her backstory has always been the quiet ache underneath her cheerfulness. The toy who was loved completely and then, for reasons she never got to understand, simply wasn't anymore. Now she is the one the others look to, with Buzz steadying themes beside her, and the choice the film seems to be making is to let her lead, not despite that history, but because of it. She's the one who recognizes what's happening before anyone else does, because she's lived through a version of it already. That's genuine character logic, not the toy who's been here longest takes charge, but the toy who already survived this exact feeling once is the only one equipped to help the others survive it now. Think about what that means for how she carries herself through everything that follows. Every choice she makes from here is shadowed by a choice she didn't get to make decades ago when she was the one left behind. Around her, the film fills out its world with new toys, and each one feels less like a joke delivery system and more like a different possible response to the same fear. Which one of these calling cards apply, I think, depends entirely on the kind of person you already are. Smarty Pants, voiced with exactly the kind of Mutama's energy you'd hope for, is a toilet training tech toy, built, quite literally, to instruct. He's confident, a little insufferable, and from what's been teased, an instant scene stealer, precisely because he represents the toy's worst fear taken to its most absurd extreme, a toy that doesn't fear technology at all because he is technology, fully at ease in a world the others find threatening. Atlas, the GPS hippo, seems to occupy a gentler middle ground, a toy whose entire function is about helping others find their way, which feels almost like a quiet rebuttal to Lilypad before the film even needs to argue anything directly. And then there's Dr. Nutcase, described as tech-fearing, who I suspect functions as a kind of exaggerated mirror for the audience members who walked into this film already bracing for an anti-technology message. If the marketing made you nervous about where this story was going to land, Dr. Nutcase might be the character built to gently poke at that exact nervousness. Running alongside all of this, and this is where the film's structure gets genuinely interesting, is Woody's thread, and it unfolds almost entirely apart from Bonnie's room. He's out in the world doing the work he chose at the end of the last film, finding homes for toys nobody wants anymore. And the film, from what's been described, takes him somewhere specific for this, an abandoned backyard shed, home to a small community of forgotten toys. This is where Pizza with Sunglasses lives, described as effortlessly cool and mysterious, part of a small but mighty crew that's been getting by without any child at all. Here is the thing about this thread that I think matters enormously. These are toys who already lost the thing Bonnie's toys are afraid of losing. They're not anxious about becoming irrelevant. They already are by the only definition that's ever mattered in this universe. No kid, no room, no purpose in the traditional sense. And yet, from everything that's been shown, they are not portrayed as tragic. They've built something among themselves, a community, a kind of meaning that doesn't depend on being chosen by a child at all. Putting those two threads side by side, Fanny's toys terrified of becoming optional, and Woody's forgotten toys who've already crossed that line and found a way to keep living anyway, does something quietly devastating if you let it land. It suggests, even before the story has resolved anything, that the ending the first group fears might not actually be an ending. It might just be a different kind of beginning. Whether the film is building toward that idea on purpose or whether I'm reading more into the parallel than it intends, I genuinely don't know yet. But the structure puts these two realities in the same film at the same time, and structure like that doesn't usually happen by accident. This is also where I want to talk about pacing, because more than one person coming out of the premiere mentioned that the opening stretch feels a little scattered. Multiple storylines, multiple casts of characters, multiple emotional registers, all introduced before they start talking to each other. And I understand why that reads as a flaw on a first pass. But think about what this film is actually about, a household where attention has become divided, where focus is splintered between the old and the new, where nobody, not the toys, not Bonnie, maybe not even the film itself in its opening minutes, is fully present in one place at one time. A story about fractured attention, told through a structure that itself asks you to hold several things in your attention at once before they resolve into a single shape. I'm not certain that's deliberate, but I noticed it, and once I noticed it, I couldn't stop feeling it. Every cut between threads landed like a small, familiar tug, the same tug you feel when your own attention gets pulled somewhere new before you finished with where you are. And then the threads start to pull toward each other. What reaches Woody? Out there in the world, away from the room he spent so long calling home, that something is wrong back with Jessie and the others. And here's what I find quietly moving about how this is set up. Woody chose to leave. He chose a different purpose, a different life, one that didn't revolve around Bonnie's room anymore. But the moment he hears his friends might be in trouble, none of that hesitation matters. He goes, not because duty demands it, but because some bonds don't dissolve just because you've outgrown the room they were formed in. That choice, made instantly, without the film needing to dwell on it, tells you almost everything about what kind of story this still is, underneath all its new toys and new technology and new anxieties. It's a study about people who show up for each other. So here's where things stand, right at the edge of everything converging. Bonnie's toys are watching their place in her world quietly shrink, led by the one among them who's lived through exactly this kind of loss before. A community of toys who've already lost everything has found a way to keep going regardless. And the toy who walked away from all of it is now walking back, pulled by a loyalty that distance never managed to weaken. Three separate stories, three separate emotional temperatures, all about to occupy the same space at the same time. And here is where the film shifts completely. Before we go any further into what this film achieves, I think it's worth pulling back the curtain a little, not to break the spell, but to understand it better. Because the things a film is made of, the choices made years before a single frame reaches you, often explained by a scene lands the way it does. And this film, more than most, seems to carry its making inside its meaning. Here is the first thing worth sitting with. This is the first Toy Story film Andrew Stanton has ever directed. He co-wrote all four previous installments. He's been part of this world's voice since 1995, shaping how these characters think and speak and reason about loyalty and purpose for 3 decades. But directing is different. Directing means every frame, every silence, every choice about where the camera lingers and where it cuts away runs through one person's instincts. What that means for how this film feels is something you can sense even before you know it. A confidence in the quiet moments, a willingness to let a scene breathe a beat longer than it strictly needs to. When you watch this film and you notice a moment where the camera just stays a little longer than you expect on a character's face after they've stopped talking, that's worth remembering. That's not a writer's choice translated by someone else. That's the person who helped build this entire world's emotional vocabulary finally getting to decide in real time how it should be spoken. Now, here's something that I think reshapes how you hear this film in a way that's genuinely moving, and it has to do with voices, quite literally. If you followed this franchise closely, you may already know that Toy Story 4 quietly carried a kind of ghost in its sound design. Don Rickles, who'd voiced Mr. Potato Head since the very beginning, passed away during that film's production, and the studio used archival recordings to let him finish the role one last time. Mrs. Potato Head's original voice, Estelle Harris, has also since passed, and Timothy Dalton's voice work as Mr. Pricklepants in Toy Story 4 was, reportedly, his final voice performance. This film recasts all three roles. Duff Bergman now voices Mr. Potato Head, Anna Vocino takes over as Mrs. Potato Head, and John Hopkins steps into Prickle Pines. Think about what that means for a moment. Set against everything we've already talked about, a film about toys facing the reality that the voices and presences that define the room don't last forever, made by a production that has, in its own very real way, had to do exactly that. New voices stepping into roles that real people can no longer fill. When you hear Mr. Nunn, Potato Head crack a joke in this film, there's a strange and tender doubling there, whether the filmmakers intended it or not, a toy continuing on, voiced by someone new, in a story about what it means for things to continue on after the people who shaped them are gone. That same thread runs through another casting change, and I want to handle this one gently because it touches something real. Kumbat. Guard. A recurring character in this world was voiced by Carl Weathers, and Weathers passed away in 2024. In this film, Arnie Hudson steps into that role. There's nothing to analyze here in the way we usually analyze a creative choice. It's simply a fact of how films like this get made across years and years of production. Actors leave us, and the work continues, carried forward by someone else with the same care. I mention it not to dwell on it, but because I think it's part of the emotional texture sitting underneath this entire film, whether you're consciously aware of it or not. A story about legacy, made by people who've lived legacy in the most human way possible. And then there's the thread that runs through every single one of these films, unbroken, for 30 years. Randy Newman. This is his fifth Toy Story score. 5 films, 3 decades, one composer. In an industry where almost nothing else has stayed constant that long, the actual sound of this world, its musical language, has one continuous author. Here's how that reshapes a moment for me any time the score swells in this film. Anytime you hear that particular Newman warmth, the kind that's been with these characters since Woody first pulled his string and said his catchphrase in 1995, you're hearing the one piece of this franchise that has genuinely never been replaced. while everything else in this story is about things being replaced, about new arrivals and new technology and new voices stepping into old roles. The music itself is the one constant. I don't think that's something the filmmakers needed to plan. I think it's just true. And once you notice it, you can't stop hearing it that way. On the casting side, more broadly, what's been described from recording sessions is worth dwelling on. John Cusack and Tim Allen reportedly embraced the shift in Jessie and Buzz's dynamic, Jessie stepping forward, Buzz settling into a steadier, more supportive role beside her, and according to people involved, that wasn't a hard sell. After 3 decades of playing these characters, actors tend to know, almost physically, when a shift in a relationship feels true to who these people have become. Cretali, meanwhile, was reportedly given recare in how Lilypad was shaped. Stanton and Harris have both spoken about wanting her to feel playfully antagonistic rather than simply villainous, and that's an unusually difficult note to hit in voice work. It asks an actor to be charming and unsettling in the same breath, often in the same line. And then there's Conan O'Brien, whose energy as Marty Pants is already being singled out by people who've seen the film, which, if you know his comic rhythms at all, makes a strange kind of sense. A toilet training toy who thinks he knows everything is, in a way, the perfect role for someone whose entire career has been built on a very specific, very fast, very confident kind of talking. Here's a fifth thing, and it might be my favorite because it's the most recent and the most uncertain. Taylor Swift's involvement. Her original song I Knew It, I Knew You, performed live at the premiere alongside Randy Newman himself, wasn't confirmed until June 1st, just over a week before the premiere. According to multiple reports, even the film's own stars weren't aware of her involvement until shortly before it became public. Earlier in the production cycle, Stanton had reportedly addressed fan speculation about a Swift collaboration by saying the studio would be freaking honored to work with her, while also indicating that at that point, no such song existed in the finished film. And then weeks later, it did. Think about what that means for how this film's ending was assembled. The emotional note this story closes on, whatever that note turns out to be, was by all appearances still being searched for, right up until the very last possible moment. That's not how franchises usually operate. Usually, the ending is the most locked down, most protected piece of the entire production. Here, it sounds like even the people who made this film were still listening for the right way to say goodbye, almost until the lights went up. As for the world itself, the physical world this film was built inside, it's worth remembering that all of this, every blade of grass on that deserted island, every worn edge on every toy in that backyard shed, every warm beam of light in Bonnie's room, was constructed entirely inside computers at Pixar's studio in Emeryville, California. There's no real location to visit, no set to walk through. And yet the textures feel lived in a way that takes enormous invisible effort, the kind of effort that only shows up as an absence of effort, as a room that simply feels like somewhere a child actually lives. That's the strange magic of this kind of filmmaking. Nothing here is real, and all of it feels like somewhere you've been. There's a difference between a film that simply works and a film that achieves something, and I think the distinction comes down to whether you can point at specific choices and say with confidence, that's why this landed the way it did. So let's do that. Let's look at what this film actually does piece by piece and ask why each piece works the way it seems to. Start with performance because that's where a film either earns your trust or doesn't. John Cusack has been voicing Jessie since Toy Story 2, and across 3 decades, that character has always carried more weight than her screen time technically demanded, a backstory of abandonment that the films kept circling without ever fully resolving, an undercurrent of grief sitting just beneath her energy and warmth. What's being described out of the premiere is that this film finally gives Cusack the material to bring that undercurrent fully to the surface. One critic put it simply that she breaks your heart wide open, describing Jessie as rediscovering her purpose. I want to be honest with you, I don't yet know the specific scene that does this, the exact moment where that happens on screen. But I can tell you why a moment like that would land so hard, structurally. Jessie has spent 30 years as the character who knows what it feels like to be set aside. If this film puts her in a position where she has to face that fear again, not as someone else's story this time, but as her own happening right now, then whatever that scene turns out to be, it's been 30 years in the making. That's not a coincidence of good writing. That's a payoff that's been quietly accumulating since 1999, whether anyone watching back then knew it or not. Then there's Conan O'Brien as Martipans, and I think this is a case where the casting itself is the performance in a way. O'Brien's entire comedic identity is built around a very specific rhythm, fast, confident, slightly too pleased with himself, the sound of someone who's already three thoughts ahead of the conversation and wants you to know it. Put that energy inside a toilet training toy, a device whose entire purpose is to instruct, to correct, to tell you with absolute certainty that you are doing something wrong. And you get a character who's funny, not because the jokes are clever, but because the voice and the role are so perfectly matched that the character almost writes itself. That's a kind of achievement that's easy to overlook because it looks effortless. But matching an actor's natural cadence to a character's function, this precisely is its own form of writing, even before a single line of dialogue gets written. And then there's Cretali as Lilypad, which I think might be the hardest acting job in the entire film, even though, or maybe because, she's playing a tablet. Stanton and Harris have both talked about wanting her performance to be playfully antagonistic, which is a genuinely difficult tone to hold, too playful, and there's no tension, too antagonistic, and the whole film collapses into the simple screens are bad message is reportedly working hard to avoid. From what's being described, lead threats that neither charming enough that you understand exactly why Bonnie loves her, with just enough of an edge that you understand exactly why the toys are afraid. The why here matters enormously. If Lilliput were simply unlikable, the toy's fear would feel justified and the film would have nothing real to say. But if she's genuinely good, genuinely fun, genuinely kind to Bonnie in her own way, then the toy's fear isn't about her at all, it's about themselves, about what they are or aren't compared to her. That's a much harder, much more honest fear, and it only works if the performance makes you, the audience, also like her a little, which, by every account, it does. Now, the writing, and here's where I think this film does something rare. The premise on paper is the kind of thing that could go badly wrong in a dozen ways. Toys versus a tablet could easily become a simple morality tale. Technology bad, old fashioned toys good, lesson learned, credits rolled. That version of this film exists somewhere in a version of this script that was never made. What's actually being described is something more nuanced. One critic specifically noted that the film takes a hard stance on one human connection being key for children, which is a meaningfully different argument than screens are evil. Here's why that distinction matters. An argument about screens being evil is an argument about an object. An argument about human connection being essential is an argument about a need, and needs can be met in different ways by different things, including sometimes by technology itself. By framing the conflict around what children need rather than what device is doing the providing, the film leaves itself room to be generous toward Lilypad, generous toward Bonnie's choices, and still land its emotional point. That's a much harder thing to write than a simple morality tale, and it's the kind of choice that usually only shows up when a script has been worked and reworked by people who actually care about getting it right rather than people who just need a villain by the end of Act 1. The visual language of this film, from what's been shown, seems built around a very specific kind of contrast, and I think it's a contrast of light. Bonnie's room, as we talked about earlier, has always been rendered with that warm golden, slightly nostalgic glow. The kind of light that makes plastic toys look like they're holding their breath, the kind of light that feels like a memory even while you're watching it happen in the present. Lilypad, by contrast, is a scream. Screens have their own light, cooler, sharper, a glow that comes from inside rather than falling across a surface from somewhere else. Even the opening sequence, with its dozens of Buzz Lightyear figures each carrying their own small glowing display, sets up this visual vocabulary before the story even reaches Bonnie's room. Warm light versus screen light. Light that falls on things versus light that comes from within them. Why does this matter? Because it gives the film a way to make its central tension visible in every single frame without anyone needing to say a word about it. You don't need a character to explain that something has changed in this room. You can feel it in how the room is lit, the moment something with its own glow enters a space that's always been lit from outside. And then there's silence, or rather the way this film seems to use stillness based on everything that's circled out of early reactions. We've already talked about how the camera, under Stanton's direction for the first time, seems willing to hold on faces a bit longer than expected. It's a directorial choice with a very specific effect. It asks you to read an expression rather than be told what it means. A toy's face holding still while something shifts in a room. That's a moment that asks you to do some of the emotional work yourself, to recognize what you're looking at because you felt something like it. Cinema rarely trusts an audience that much, especially in a film built for kids. But trusting the audience to sit in a quiet moment without rushing to explain it is, I think, one of the clearest signs of a filmmaker who respects the people watching, all of them, child and adult alike. Finally, the sound, and this is where Randy Newman's 30-year continuity becomes, I think, one of the most quietly powerful tools this film has. Newman's musical voice has been present in every single film in this franchise, which means his score doesn't just accompany the story, it remembers the other four. When his music swells under a moment in this film, it's carrying, whether you consciously registered or not, an echo of every other moment his music has scored across 3 decades of this world. That's an enormous well of emotional association for a composer to be able to draw from, and very few franchises have kept that thread unbroken long enough to use it. And then, layered against that 30-year continuity, there's the new addition. Taylor Swift's I Knew It, I Knew You, confirmed only days before the premiere, performed live alongside Newman himself. Think about what that pairing does structurally. An old voice and a new one, sharing a stage for a film about exactly that question, what happens when something old has to make room for something new. Whether that song appears at the very end of the film or somewhere else entirely, its existence alongside Neiman's score mirrors the film's own central question in the most literal way possible. Can the old and the new occupy the same space and still sound like they belong together? From everything available right now, the answer this film seems to be reaching for is yes, but not easily and not without cost. And that, more than any single scene or performance, might be the achievement that holds everything else together. There's a kind of communication that happens in this franchise that has nothing to do with dialogue, and if there's one thing this particular film seems built to lean into, it's that toys in this world can never speak when a human might see or hear them. That constraint, which has been part of this universe since 1995, has always forced these films to find other ways to say things. A glance, a held posture, the particular way a toy goes still the instant before a door opens. 30 years in, that constraint hasn't become a limitation, it's become a language. And this film, more than maybe any other entry in the series, seems to be speaking it fluently. Think about the moment we keep coming back to Woody's absence from Bonnie's room. The film doesn't need a character to say Woody isn't here anymore. It doesn't need a scene of someone explaining where he's gone or why. It just needs the room to feel different. A walkie talkie sitting somewhere it didn't used to sit, a space on a shelf or in a formation where someone used to stand. Absence in cinema is almost always more powerful when it's spatial rather than spoken. When you feel a gap before you understand what used to fill it, that's not a small trick. It's the film trusting that you spent enough time in this room across enough films to notice what's missing without being told. And if you have spent that time, if this room is in some small way a room you've lived into across 30 years of your own life, that gap registers almost physically before your conscious mind catches up to what it means. Now think about the opening sequence again. All those identical Buzz Lightyear figures on that island, each one carrying its own small glowing screen, chanting towards Star Command under the night sky. Here's what I keep returning to about that scene. It's full of communication and none of it is real. Every one of those buzzes is transmitting. Every one of them is reaching outward, calling towards something. And not one of them is actually being heard, because the thing they're calling toward was never real to begin with. It was always just a setting, a default, a piece of factory programming mistaken for a purpose. There's something almost unbearably sad about that, dressed up as something whimsical, a whole island full of voices, none of them landing anywhere. Cinema rarely does this, takes a moment that looks on the surface like a gag and quietly builds it into something that functions almost like a warning for everything that follows. What does it mean to keep transmitting faithfully towards something that was never listening? And then there's the light. We've talked about this already, but it belongs here too because light might be the purest form of silent language this film has. Warm light falling across a room from outside, cool light glowing from within a screen. The film doesn't need a character to say something has changed in how this room feels. It just needs you to notice, almost subconsciously, that there's a new kind of glow in it now. One that doesn't come from a window, or a lamp, or the sun. One that comes from the thing itself. Light that originates from within a screen versus light that falls onto a toy from somewhere else carries an entire argument about presence and self sufficiency without a single word being spoken. A toy can only ever reflect the light around it. A screen makes its own. That's not a metaphor the film has to explain. It's one you can feel just by watching where the brightness in a frame is coming from. Here's what I think is the most quietly devastating possibility in this entire film, and it's something the film may never show you directly, and that's exactly the point. Somewhere in this story, there's almost certainly a moment where Bonnie puts a toy down. Not dramatically, not with any awareness that it matters, just the ordinary, distracted way a child sets something aside when something else catches their eye. If this film is doing what it seems to be doing, it probably doesn't linger on that moment from Bonnie's side at all. It probably barely registers as an event to her. The weight of it would live entirely on the toy's side, the stillness of being set down, the toy's awareness that this is happening, against a child's complete unawareness that anything is happening at all. That asymmetry, one character experiencing a small ending, the other not even noticing a beginning of anything, is the kind of moment a film can only deliver through silence. The second a character says, "You don't need me anymore," the moment becomes about being told something. The power is in not being told, in that gap between what one character feels and what the other doesn't even register. This is, I think, where Jessie's history becomes most powerful, not in anything she says, but in how she might simply watch. If this film puts her in a position to witness something happening to Bonnie's toys that mirrors what happened to her decades ago, the most devastating version of that scene wouldn't involve her saying, "I know exactly what this feels like." It would just involve her face, holding still, a bit longer than expected, letting you do the work of remembering her own backstory, layering it underneath whatever she's watching now, without the film needing to connect those dots out loud. Here is what I keep returning to about silence in this franchise: it's never empty. It's always full of everything the film has already taught you, waiting to be remembered at exactly the right moment. What this film seems to understand, more than almost anything else it does, is that the things we can't say out loud are often the truest things we feel, and that a story about toys, who can never speak when it matters most, might be uniquely positioned to say that truth more honestly than almost any other kind of story could. This is the part of the essay where I'm going to be most careful and most honest about the limits of what I actually know. I haven't seen this film in full. Nobody outside of a handful of premiere attendees and embargoed critics has, as of this recording. So what follows isn't a verdict. It's something closer to a list of tensions, places where, based on everything that's been reported, this film seems to be taking real risks, and where those risks could either pay off beautifully or leave something feeling thinner than it should. Fair criticism to me means naming those tensions honestly, rather than pretending a film is anticipated is beyond question just because the early word has been glowing. The first tension is the one we've already talked about, but it deserves to be looked at again from the other side. More than one person at the premiere described the opening as a tiny bit disjointed. multiple storylines being set up before they start talking to each other. Earlier in this essay, I offered a generous reading of that, a film about fractured attention told through a structure that itself feels fractured, form mirroring content. I still think the reading is worth holding on to. But I also want to be honest that it's a reading, a way of making sense of a structural choice after the fact, and structural choices don't always carry the meaning we assign to them. It's entirely possible that the opening simply has too much to set up. Three new locations, half a dozen new characters, two returning leads operating in different places, and a tablet that needs to be introduced with enough nuance to avoid feeling like a cartoon villain. That's an enormous amount of table setting for any film to do gracefully, no matter how thematically justified the busyness might be. Is the payoff in the back half is as strong as people are saying, and the consensus on the third act has been remarkably consistent, then this is probably minor texture, the kind of thing you forget by the time the credits roll. But if there's a version of this film where that opening stretch never quite resolves the threads it sets up, where some of those early storylines simply thin out rather than converge, that would be a real wound, not a stylistic flourish. I genuinely don't know which version we are getting yet. The second tension is about scale, and it's connected to the first. This film is introducing an unusually large number of new characters: Lilypad, Smarty Pants, Atlas, Doctor, Nutcase, Snappy, the forgotten toy community in the shed, including Pizza with sunglasses, Evil Bullseye as a kind of imagination sequence aside, plus a new adult human character voiced by Chris Marshall. That's a lot of new presences to introduce alongside an ensemble that was already large to begin with. Some of these characters are clearly built for a specific content function. Smarty Pants as comic energy, Dr. Nutcase as a particular kind of anxiety given a face. There's nothing wrong with that. Not every character in an ensemble needs deep interiority, and some of the most beloved characters in this franchise's history have been exactly this kind of sharply drawn supporting presence. But when a film adds this many new faces at once, there's a real risk that a few of them end up feeling more like concepts than characters. Clever ideas, a GPS hippo, a toilet training toy, an effortlessly cool, forgotten toy voiced by one of the biggest music stars in the world that work in a trailer in isolation, but that the finished film simply doesn't have time to make feel like anyone. Where that happens here, I can't say. But it's the kind of thing that tends to happen when a film this emotionally ambitious also tries to be depopulated. That tension is one I think is worth sitting with honestly, even though it feels almost unfair to raise it. This is the fifth film in a franchise where the previous two entries both already delivered, by wide consensus, some of the most devastating endings in modern animated cinema. Toy Story 3's Farewell and Toy Story 4's Quieter Goodbye both worked in part because they felt earned by everything that came before, and because at the time each one plausibly could have been the last word on these characters. A fifth film runs the risk of asking an audience to feel that kind of ending a third time on a theme, being outgrown, becoming optional, facing replacement, that this franchise has now explored from several angles. The toy meets tech framing gives this film a genuinely fresh entry point into that theme, and from what's been described, it sounds like the film finds real new territory within it. But there's a difference between a new entry point and a genuinely new destination, and I won't know until I've seen the whole thing whether this film's emotional conclusion feels like it's saying something this franchise hasn't said before, or whether it's saying something true but familiar: trust in new technology. The fourth tension is smaller but worth naming because it touches on something the film's own marketing leans into heavily: the cameo driven, event film quality of its rollout. Bad Bunny as Pizza with sunglasses, Alan Cumming as Evil Bullseye, Taylor Swift's song, confirmed days before the premiere, performed live alongside Randy Newman. Each of these on its own sounds genuinely thoughtful. Cummings' role is reportedly a brief imagination sequence aside, not a major plot thread, and Swift's involvement seems to have been handled with real care rather than as a marketing afterthought. but taken together, there's a pattern here that's worth watching for. A film that's also unavoidably uneven, with capital E weight, awards season positioning, surprise celebrity appearances, a premiere that became its own news cycle days before the movie even opened. None of that is the film's fault exactly, but it does mean this story is arriving with an enormous amount of noise around it, and noise like that can sometimes make it harder for a film's quieter moments to land the way they're meant to, simply because the audience walks in primed for spectacle rather than stillness. Is any of this a rare wound? Based on everything I currently have access to, the consistency of the premiere reactions, the specific praise for the third act, the way critics who came in skeptical reportedly came out moved, my honest guess is no. These read to me right now like the kind of minor textures that exist in almost every ambitious film, the scenes that are there if you go looking for them, but that don't actually interfere with the experience most people will have. But I want to leave room for the possibility that I am wrong, because I think that honesty matters more than confidence here. What I can tell you is this: if this film has a real flaw, my guess is it's hiding somewhere in that opening stretch, in whether all of those threads it sets up actually get the resolution they deserve, or whether some of them simply get left quietly on that island, still blowing, still calling out towards something that was never going to answer. Strip away everything else, the trailers, the cast list, the premiere, the awards talk, and what is this film actually trying to say? Not what's it about in the sense of plot. What is it trying to leave you with? Once the lights come back up and you're walking out to your car. I think it's this, that being loved and being needed are not the same thing, and most of us spend our lives confusing the two. Every toy in this world has organized its entire sense of self around being needed by a child. That's not incidental to who they are, it's the foundation of it. Woody's whole identity across 5 films now has been built on being chosen, being the favorite, being the one a kid reaches for first. And what this film seems to be settling through Jessie, through the toys watching Lilypad arrive, through the island full of buzzes still chanting toward a command structure that never existed, is the question of what's left of you when the needing stops but the loving somehow doesn't. Because here's the thing this film understands, and it's a genuinely hard thing to understand. A child outgrowing a toy isn't usually a withdrawal of love, it's just growth. Bonnie putting Lilypad in her hands more often than she reaches for Jessie doesn't mean Bonnie has stopped loving Jessie. It might not even register to Bonnie as a choice at all, but to Jessie, to anyone whose whole sense of worth has been built on being the thing reached for first, that distinction between you're not needed the same way anymore and you're not loved anymore is almost impossible to feel from the inside. They feel identical. And I think that's the emotional core this entire film is built around. The gap between what's actually happening and what it feels like is happening when you're the one standing slightly outside the center of someone else's attention for the first time. Think about what that means for your own life for a second, because I don't think this film is really asking you to think about toys at all. Think about a friendship that didn't end exactly but just thinned. Nobody did anything wrong. Life got busier, someone moved, someone had a kid, someone found new people who fit a new chapter better. The love didn't go anywhere, but the needing did, the dailiness of it, the being the first call. And if you've ever sat with that feeling, the quiet ache of still loving someone who simply doesn't need you the way they used to, then you already know exactly what this film is trying to make you feel, just wearing a cowgirl doll's hat instead of your own face. Now, the island. I keep coming back to it because I think it might be the film's clearest symbol, hiding in plain sight as the opening gag. Those Buzz Lightyear figures, glowing, chanting towards Star Command. They're devoted, genuinely, fully devoted, and their devotion is aimed at nothing. Not because devotion is foolish, but because somewhere along the way, the thing they were devoted to stopped being real, and nobody told them, and they kept going anyway, because going was all they knew how to do. Here's what that image is really asking. I think underneath the comedy of it, how do you know when the thing you're devoted to is still listening? And what do you do if you suspect it might not be, but stopping feels like its own kind of death? That question echoes everywhere in this film once you start listening for it. Bonnie's toys devoted to a child whose attention is drifting elsewhere. Woody devoted to a mission of finding homes for toys, walking back toward people he chose to leave. Even Lilypad, in her own way, a device whose entire function is built around being devoted to Bonnie's attention, programmed for exactly the kind of responsiveness the toys can't match. Everyone in this film is devoted to something. The film's real question isn't whether that devotion is good or bad. It's what happens to a person or a toy when the thing they're devoted to changes or moves or simply stops needing that devotion in the same way. Do you keep chanting towards that command forever? Or is there a way to put a loyalty down without putting down the love that built it? And then there's the forgotten toys, Butzo, Lasses, and the others, living in that backyard shed, getting by without any child at all. I think this is where the film quietly offers its gentlest answer, even if it never says it outright. These toys have already lived through the thing Bonnie's toys are afraid of. They've already become unneeded, in the most literal sense. No kid reaches for them ever. And from everything that's been described, they're not portrayed as broken by that. They've built something else, a community, a kind of life that doesn't depend on being chosen by anyone outside it. What this film seems to understand is that the ending the toys fear, becoming unneeded, isn't actually the ending. It's just a door into a different room. And what you find in that room depends less on what you've lost and more on who you find already there, having built something while you were still busy being afraid of the door. There's a version of this film's message that would be simple, almost a slogan. Put the screens down, pick the toy up, love wins. I don't think that's what this film is saying, and I think that's exactly why it's worth taking seriously. The more honest version, the version that one critic pointed to when they said the film takes a hard stance on one human connection being key for children, isn't about objects at all. It's about what a child actually needs, underneath whatever's holding their attention in any given moment. A tablet can be endlessly responsive. It can never be present in the way a person, or in this universe, a toy that loves you, can be present. Not because the tablet is evil, but because presence isn't something a screen can offer, no matter how well designed it is. That's not an argument against technology. It's an argument for something technology was never built to provide and never claimed to. Here's what I keep returning to more than anything else in this film: the idea that being outgrown and being unloved are not the same thing, and that the bravest thing any of us can do, toy or person, is to keep loving something fully even after it stops being the thing that needs you most. Not because it owes you anything in return, just because that's what love, the real kind, actually is. It doesn't end when the needing does. It just changes shape and asks you to change shape with it. That's what I think this film is really saying. Not don't grow up, not screens are bad. Just the people and things that shaped you don't stop mattering the moment they stop being necessary. And maybe the whole point of growing up, for a kid or for a toy, is learning how to carry that kind of love forward without needing it to be returned in exactly the same way it was given. If you wanted to understand Andrew Stanton as a filmmaker using a single sentence, you could do worse than this. He makes films about characters who get separated from the world they know and have to figure out who they are once the familiar shape of their life is gone. That's Finding Nemo. A father and son, torn apart by the ocean, each forced to become someone slightly different in order to find their way back to each other. That's Wally, a robot alone for centuries on an abandoned Earth, whose entire identity is built around a longing for connection he can barely articulate. That's Finding Dory, a character defined by what she's lost, quite literally, building an identity out of memory and its absence. Across each of these films, Stanton keeps returning to the same emotional architecture. Someone is removed from where they belong, and the story is less about getting back to that place than about discovering what they've become in the meantime. Now look at what this film is doing. With that lens in mind, Woody, for the first time in this franchise's history, isn't where he's always been. He chose to leave Bonnie's room at the end of the last film, a genuine logical structural choice for the series, removing its most central character from its most central location. And this film picks up with him out there, separated, doing different work, connected to his old life only through a walkie talkie. That's not just a plot detail, that's Stanton's signature, written directly into the premise. He's spent his entire directing career making films about characters who are away from home, and now, for the first time, he's bringing that exact sensibility to the franchise that made him. Except this time, instead of writing it for someone else to direct, he's the one deciding how it feels. That's another thread that runs through Stanton's work, and it's one that I think this film leans into more than any other Toy Story before it, a deep, almost philosophical interest in purpose, specifically in what happens to a character whose sense of self is built entirely around a function when that function is taken away or called into question. Wally is the clearest example. He's a trash compactor robot built for one job, left behind in a world that no longer needs that job done. And the entire film is about what he becomes once that purpose is gone, which turns out to be something far more interesting than what he was built for. That's almost exactly the question this film is asking about Bonnie's toys. They were built, quite literally, manufactured, for one purpose: to be played with, to be needed by a child. And now that purpose is being quietly challenged by something that does it better. Wally asked what a robot becomes once its job is obsolete. This film seems to be asking the same question about toys and, by extension, about anyone whose sense of self was built around being needed in one specific way. What's genuinely new here? And this is where I think this film might represent something like a peak for Stanton, rather than just a continuation, is the directness with which it engages with technology itself as part of its emotional landscape. Wall-E was set in a future shaped by humanity's relationship with consumption and convenience, but it kept the theme at a remove, embedded in world building rather than in a direct present tense conflict between characters. This film doesn't have that distance. Lilypad isn't a symbol of some future society's choices. She's a tablet in a child's room right now, doing exactly what tablets actually do. Stanton has always been a filmmaker interested in big ideas, purpose, connection, what it means to be left behind, but he's typically explored those ideas through science fiction distance, through robots and oceans and far future Earths. Here, for what might be the first time in his directing career, he's exploring those same ideas with almost no metaphorical buffer at all. The thing the characters are afraid of is the same thing sitting in your pocket right now. There's also something worth noting about Stanton's relationship to silence and stillness, which we touched on earlier but deserves to be placed in this context specifically. Wally spent its first half hour almost entirely without dialogue, an enormous risk for an animated film aimed partly at children, and one that paid off precisely because Stanton trusted the visual storytelling to carry the emotional weight. The willingness this film reportedly shows, holding on faces, letting moments breathe a bit longer than expected, isn't a new instinct for Stanton. It's the same instinct that built Wally's opening, just redirected toward a more crowded, more dialogue heavy world. The toys in this universe can talk to each other constantly in ways Wally's characters mostly couldn't. But the director bringing his eye to this film is someone who has already proven in his own filmography that he doesn't need dialogue to make you feel something, and that instinct, even in a chattier world, seems to still be guiding where the camera chooses to look and for how long. So, is this film a continuation, a departure, or a peak? I think it's a genuine synthesis. Maybe the first time Stanton has been able to bring everything he spent his directing career exploring back to the world that gave him his start. The interest in displacement brought home to the franchise's most central character leaving its most central location for the first time. The interest in purpose and obsolescence brought directly into a present tense conflict with the exact technology reshaping childhood right now. The trust in stillness and silence applied to a world built on constant chatter. Watching this film teaches you something about how Stanton sees the world, I think. That he believes the biggest, most universal questions a story can ask are best explored through someone or something that's been quietly removed from the center of things and is trying to figure out what that means. He spent 20 years writing that idea for other directors. Now, for the first time, he's the one deciding exactly how it should feel. 5 films, 30 years, and at every single point along the way, this franchise has had to answer the same question: why does this one need to exist? Toy Story 2 had to justify itself against an original that already felt complete. Toy Story 3 had to justify itself against 11 years of silence and the very real possibility that Pixar had simply moved on. Toy Story 4 had to justify itself against an ending, Andy's farewell, that a huge number of people considered sacred, untouchable, the actual conclusion. And now this film has to justify itself against two endings, two films that each, in their own way, told you this story was over. So where does this turn actually sit inside all of that? I think the honest answer is that this film isn't trying to top either of those endings, and that's precisely why it might work. Toy Story 3 was about a child growing up and the toys being passed on. Toy Story 4 was about Woody finding a different kind of purpose outside the world he'd always known. Both of those films were, in their own ways, about endings, about a chapter closing with grace after a long and full life. This film, by contrast, seems to be about something that happens before an ending. Bonnie is 8. She hasn't grown up and grown out of her toys the way Andy did. What's happening here isn't a graduation. It's something smaller, messier, and in some ways more universal. The slow, undramatic shift in attention that happens long before any clean goodbye. The kind of shift that doesn't have a tidy emotional shape yet, because it's still happening, still unresolved, still being lived through in real time. If Toy Story 3 was about the ending and Toy Story 4 was about what comes after an ending, this film might be about the middle, the part where nothing has ended yet, but something is clearly changing, and nobody quite knows what to call it. That's a genuinely different emotional territory for this franchise, and I think it's the reason this film doesn't feel redundant on paper the way a fifth entry easily could. It's not retelling either of the previous goodbyes. It's looking at the long, uncertain stretch of time before a goodbye even becomes necessary, which, if you think about it, is actually where most of us spend most of our lives. Most relationships, most attachments, most chapters of our lives don't end with a clean scored, tearful farewell. They just slowly become something else while we're still standing in the middle of them, not yet sure whether what's happening is an ending at all. Does it deepen what came before or repeat it? I think deepen, and specifically to Jessie. Her backstory has been part of this franchise since Toy Story 2, but it's always functioned as backstory, something that happened to her in the past that explains who she is now. This film, from everything that's been described, seems to bring that history into the present tense for the first time. Not this is what happened to Jessie once, but this is happening to Jessie's friends right now, and Jessie is the only one who's lived through it before. That's not repetition. That's a 30-year-old piece of character history finally becoming active again, finally mattering to the plot in real time rather than just informing a character's personality from a distance. If that's what this film does with her, it's one of the more elegant pieces of long form storytelling this franchise has attempted, taking something planted decades ago and finally letting it bloom into the present. As for what this film adds to the larger conversation, I think it's permission in a strange way. Permission for this franchise to exist in the present tense rather than only ever looking backward at childhood as something already lost. The first 4 films, for all their different approaches, were largely about looking back, about growing up, moving on, letting go. This film, by centering itself on a present tense conflict with present tense technology, gives this word a way to keep being relevant without simply repeating the same goodbye over and over. It's not asking how do we say farewell to childhood again. It's asking what does childhood actually look like right now, and what do these characters mean inside that, and what does it shape going forward. Honestly, I think it opens a door this franchise has never really had open before. The idea that these characters don't only exist to process endings, They can exist inside an ongoing present, responding to a world that keeps changing around them, the same way it keeps changing around all of us. Whether Pixar ever walks through that door again with a sixth film is impossible to know. But this film, if it does what it seems to be doing, proves that door exists. That there's still genuinely new emotional ground for these characters to stand on. Not just new goodbyes to write, but new versions of what it means to keep going together while everything around them keeps changing shape. No film exists in isolation, even one as singular as this franchise has always felt. Every story about objects coming alive, every story about technology reshaping a home, every story about something old standing quietly beside something new. This film is having a conversation with all of them, whether it means to or not. So let's trace some of those lines and see what this film inherits and what it might be doing with that inheritance that those earlier stories couldn't. Start at the root of it all because Toy Story itself didn't invent the idea of household objects with secret inner lives afraid of being replaced. That idea has a direct ancestor in The Brave Little Toaster, a 1987 animated film about a group of aging household appliances, a toaster, a radio, a vacuum cleaner, left behind in an empty house and setting out to find their owner, all while newer, slicker appliances wait to take their place. Several of the animators who would go on to found Pixar worked on that film, and the DNA is unmistakable once you know to look for it. The anxiety of obsolescence, the loyalty of obsolescence, the loyalty of objects to the people who chose them, the quiet fear of being replaced by something shinier. Toy Story took that DNA and gave it warmth, scale, and emotional sophistication that The Brave Little Toaster, for all its charm, never quite reached. And now, 30 years later, this film returns almost directly to that founding anxiety, except instead of a newer toaster, the threat is a tablet. The wheel has turned, but the shape of the fear hasn't changed at all. If anything, this film feels like it's closing a loop that's been open since before Pixar even existed as Pixar. There's also the matter of Pixar's own triggering obsession with giving inner lives to things that, by every ordinary measure, shouldn't have one. Cars gave personalities to vehicles. Inside Out gave physical form to emotions themselves. Ratatouille gave a rat the soul of an artist. This is a studio that has built its entire identity on the premise that anything, can have a perspective worth taking seriously, if you're willing to look at it closely enough. What's interesting about this film inside that tradition is that it extends the premise to include the very thing that usually gets cast as the enemy of imagination in stories like this, a screen. Lilypad isn't framed as a soulless object the way screens so often are in stories that want to make a simple point about technology. She gets the same treatment every other character in this universe gets, an inner life, a personality, motivations that make sense from her own point of view. That's Pixar's founding philosophy, turned inward on the one kind of object that philosophy is rarely extended to. Zoom out further, and this view is joining a much broader, much more contemporary conversation, one that's been playing out across cinema for the past decade or so, about what it means to form a relationship with something that isn't human but that's genuinely good at making you feel like it understands you. Spike Jones had told that story for adults, a man falling in love with an operating system that seems to know him better than the people in his life do, and the film's quiet tragedy was less about the AI itself than about what its existence revealed about the gaps in human connection that made room for it. That film and others like it tend to land in one of two emotional registers, either deep melancholy or outright dread. Something has gone wrong with how we relate to each other, and technology is both the symptom and the wound. What's notable of this film, joining that same broad conversation, is that it seems to be reaching for a third register entirely. Not melancholy, not dread, something closer to a clear eyed tenderness. Lilypad isn't a symptom of something broken. She's just new and good at what she does, and the film's emotional work isn't about diagnosing what's wrong with a child who likes her. It's about helping the toys and by extension us find a way to hold on to what they offer that a tablet simply can't. without needing the tablet to be the villain in order to do it. That's a genuinely different contribution to this conversation, and I think it matters that it's coming from a children's film. Most of cinema's deepest meditations on AI companionship have been aimed at adults, wrapped in melancholy or unease, because adult audiences are assumed to be able to sit with ambiguity and loss. Children's films, by contrast, have tended to avoid this territory almost entirely or to flatten it into simple morality. Robots are either friendly helpers or sinister threats, rarely anything more complicated. This film, if it's doing what it seems to be doing, is bringing the nuance of her into a register built for an 8-year-old and the adult sitting next to them without losing that nuance in translation. That's not nothing. That's a film trying to give a genuinely complicated, genuinely contemporary feeling to an audience that's rarely been trusted with it before. And then there's the visual restraint we keep circling back to, the held faces, the trust in stillness, the willingness to let a frame sit a beat longer than expected. Pixar, as a studio, has never been shy about its tag to Studio Ghibli in this regard. Hayao Miyazaki's films have long been held up across the animation world as a kind of master class in what's sometimes called the Japanese concept of meaningful emptiness, the pause between actions that carries as much weight as the actions themselves. A character looking out a window for a few seconds longer than a Western film would typically allow. A room held on screen with nobody in it. That sensibility has quietly shaped how Pixar's best films breathe even when the connection isn't explicit. What this film seems to be doing, letting silence carry the weight of Woody's absence, letting a held expression say what dialogue can't, feels like it's drawing from that same well, applied to a story that's on its surface about something as loud and chaotic as a toy box. So what does this film add to all of this? To the brave little toaster's fear of replacement, to Pixar's own tradition of giving things a soul, to hers melancholy about artificial connection, to Ghibli's patient stillness. I think it's this. It takes all of those threads, which have mostly existed in separate corners of cinema, aimed at different audiences in different tones, and weaves them into a single story that a family can sit through together, right now about the exact thing happening in their own living room. The conversation this film is joining has, until now, mostly happened in pieces. A melancholy adult drama here, a children's morality tale there, a quiet art house meditation on stillness somewhere else entirely. This film seems to be trying to have all of those conditions at once in the same room with everyone who lives there. That's not a small ambition. And whether it fully succeeds or not, the attempt itself feels like cinema inheriting everything that came before it and trying to give it back to an audience that's never quite been offered all of it together. From this moment, we'd normally go into full spoilers, but since this film hasn't opened yet, what follows isn't that. Consider it something closer to a prediction, built from everything we've traced across this essay so far. If you'd rather come into this film with zero preconceptions about where it's headed, even speculative ones, this is genuinely the place to step away. For everyone else, here's where I think this story goes and why. Everything we've talked about points toward a convergence, and I think that convergence is where this film finds its deepest reveal the moment everything shifts. We have three threads in motion: Bonnie's toys, watching their place in her world quietly shrink as Lilypad becomes the thing she reaches for first. Woody, pulled back from the life he chose, racing toward friends he hears are in trouble. And that strange, haunting opening, an island full of identical Buzz Lightyear figures, still chanting toward a star command that was never real. My guess is that these threads don't just meet by coincidence. I think the trouble Woody hears about is connected somehow to that island, that the malfunctioning buzzes stuck in their factory loop end up crossing paths with Bonnie's world, perhaps drawn toward the nearest thing that resembles the command structure they're still faithfully serving. If that's right, then the island sequence isn't just a striking opener, it's the literal source of whatever crisis pulls this film's three storylines into the same room. Here's why I think that matters thematically, not just mechanically. After malfunctioning, buzzes arrive in Bonnie's world, still performing their loop, still glowing, still calling out, still devoted to something that isn't listening. They become a kind of dark mirror for Bonnie's toys themselves. The toys are afraid of becoming exactly what these buzzes already are: devoted, functional, and irrelevant. Having that fear walk through the door, literally in the form of dozens of identical figures who never noticed they'd already become what the others fear becoming. That's the kind of image this franchise tends to build its third acts around. Not an external villain to defeat, but a possible future, made physical, that the characters have to look directly at. And this is where I think Jessie's arc reaches its turning point. If the toys are confronted with a room full of devoted, obsolete figures, the literalized version of their own fear, I suspect Jessie is the one who has to decide how the group responds to that. Does she lead them toward fighting that fate, or toward something else? Given everything we know about her history, the toy who already lived through becoming unneeded and found her way back from it, my prediction is that her moment isn't about defeating the puzzles or even saving them in a traditional sense. I think it's about recognizing them. Seeing in this room full of toys still faithfully performing a purpose nobody asked for anymore, an exaggerated reflection of what she went through herself, and choosing in that moment not fear but something closer to compassion. If that's the scene critics were responding to when they describe her rediscovering her purpose and said she breaks your heart wide open, I think it's because that scene isn't really about Jessie facing her own obsolescence again. It's about Jessie being the one person in the room who knows exactly what that island of toys is feeling and choosing to meet them with the kindness nobody offered her decades ago when she went through it alone. Where does Lilypad fit into this convergence? Here's my honest guess, and it's the part I feel least certain about. I don't think Lilypad ends up being defeated in any traditional sense because I don't think the film has set her up as something that can or should be defeated. Given everything we've discussed about how carefully she seems to have been written, playfully antagonistic rather than villainous, genuinely good for Bonnie in her own way, I'd expect the resolution involving her to be less about removing her from the picture and more about the toys finding their place alongside her. Maybe that means Bonnie's attention naturally settles into something more balanced. Not because anyone took Lilypad away, but because the toys figure out how to be present in a way Lilypad simply can't be, and Bonnie, in her own unspoken way, starts reaching for both. If Tiffin's real argument is that human connection, or in this case, toy connection, offers something a screen can't replicate, then the most satisfying resolution wouldn't be tablet toys win. It would be tablet fine, toys matter too, for different reasons, which is a much harder note to land, but a much truer one. As for Woody, I think his arrival is the emotional hinge of the back half, but probably not in the way you'd expect from a the hero returns just in time structure. Given that he chose to leave, and given that this film seems built around the idea that leaving doesn't mean stopping loving, my prediction is that Woody's return isn't framed as coming back to fix things. I think it's framed as showing up fully for people he loves, without that showing up requiring him to undo the choice he made to live differently. If the film lets him help and then leave again, not out of rejection but because his life now genuinely is somewhere else, that would be a remarkably mature thing for a film aimed partly at children to model. Not you can come home and everything goes back to normal, but you can show up for the people you love fully and still go live the life you've chosen. That feels, to me, like the most natural extension of where Toy Story 4 left him. Now the forgotten toys, pizza with some glasses, and the rest of that backyard shed community. We talked earlier about how this thread feels like it's offering a quiet answer to Bonnie's toys' central fear that becoming unneeded by a child isn't actually an ending, just a different kind of beginning. My guess is that this thread pays off most directly in whatever the film's final emotional beat turns out to be, not necessarily through plot mechanics, but through presence. I'd expect at least one of Bonnie's toys by the end to have some kind of meaningful contact with that community. Maybe not a permanent move, but an acknowledgement that this other way of living exists and isn't something to fear. If the ending leaves the door open, quite literally, between Bonnie's room and that shed, it would do something this franchise has never quite done before, suggest that a toy story doesn't have to end in one room, with one child, in order to still mean something. Let's talk about foreshadowing, the details that on a second viewing probably reveal themselves as setup rather than texture. The light, almost certainly. Beep spent a lot of this essay on the contrast between warm, reflected light and cool, internal screen glow, and I'd bet that contrast pays off visually in the resolution. Maybe a moment where warm light and screen light occupy the same frame without one overpowering the other, visually representing whatever balance the story lands on. The walkie-talkie, too. That small object representing Woody's continued connection despite his absence feels like the kind of detail that probably reappears at the very end, maybe literally, maybe as something one of the other toys picks up for the first time, signaling that the kind of connection Woody maintained from a distance is now something the others understand too. And Jessie's stillness, every moment where she goes quiet, watching something, holding an expression a beat too long, I'd expect those moments to form a kind of pattern that only becomes visible once you know what she's about to face. The film, I suspect, has been quietly building her toward this moment since its very first scene with her in ways that won't fully register until you've seen where it ends. As for the ending itself, what it shows and what it means, here's my best guess, held loosely. I don't think this film ends with a goodbye in the way Toy Story 3 or Toy Story 4 did. I think it ends with something quieter. Not a farewell, but a recalibration. Bonnie's room at the close of this film probably looks much like it always has. Same toys, same tablet, same warm light, but the relationships inside it have shifted in a way that's mostly invisible from the outside. The toys haven't been chosen over Lilypad. Lilypad hasn't been removed. What's changed, I think, is something only the toys themselves, and by extension only us, can perceive, a kind of peace with where they stand now. Not the center of everything the way they once were, but not nothing either. Present. Loved even if not needed in quite the same way. If Taylor Swift's song plays, where I suspect it does, over this final stretch or the credits that follow it, its title suddenly makes a different kind of sense to me. I knew it, I knew you. Recognition, not of something new, but of something that was always true. Finally being seen clearly. On post credits material, Pixar has used these on and off across the franchise, usually for one of two purposes, a final joke or a small, quiet coda that recontextualizes something from earlier. Given how carefully this film seems to be handling its emotional through lines, I'd lean toward the latter. If there's a post credit scene, my guess is it involves either the Forgotten Toy community or the Buzz Lightyear figures from the island, some small image confirming that the other lives this film is geared toward are still going, still meaningful, even after the main story has resolved. Something that says this isn't the only room where a toy story matters. And as for sensitive material, the film's central tension, a child's attention shifting toward technology in ways that genuinely concern the people who love them, is the kind of thing that, handled badly, could tip into something punitive or anxious. But everything about how this film has been described, generous toward Lilypad, careful with Bonnie, more interested in connection than blame, suggests it's handling that tension with real care. If there's a moment of genuine sadness at its core, and I suspect there is, somewhere in Jessie's arc especially, I'd expect it to be treated the way this franchise has always treated its hardest moments, with weight, with silence, and without ever needing to spell out exactly what's been lost in order for you to feel it. And that's where I think this film goes. I could be wrong about almost all of it, the specific mechanics certainly, and maybe even the broader shape. But I don't think I'm wrong about what it's reaching for. Everything this essay has traced, the light, the silence, Justice's history, the island, the forgotten toys, the careful, generous way Lilypad seems to have been written, all of it points toward the same destination, a film that doesn't ask you to choose between the old and the new, but asks you to notice that love doesn't require you to be chosen at all. And if that's where it lands, I think it'll have done something this franchise has never quite done before, given its characters and us a genuinely new way to say goodbye to nothing at all. I want to step away from everything we've just done, the structure, the symbolism, the predictions, all of it, and just talk to you for a minute. Because here's the strange position I find myself in, sitting at the end of this essay. I haven't actually seen this film yet, not the whole thing, not the ending, and yet somehow spending this much time with it, really sitting with it, the way we do here, has already left something behind in me. Not from the film itself exactly, from thinking about it is hard. The image that hasn't left me isn't from the trailers, and it isn't anything I predicted about the ending. It's smaller than that. It's the idea of Bonnie putting a toy down without noticing. That moment we talked about, the one the film will probably never show directly, the one that lives entirely on the toy's side of the room. I keep coming back to it, and not because of what it says about toys, because of what it made me think about, almost against my will, in my own life. There's a version of that moment that's happened to all of us on both sides. A friend you used to call every day, who you now think of fondly and rarely think to call at all. Not because anything went wrong, just because life filled in around a space that used to be theirs. A hobby that used to feel like part of who you are, that you haven't picked up in years, not from any decision, just from drift. And on the other side, you've been the thing someone set down to, gently, without cruelty, just because something else, something easier or newer or simply closer at hand, was there instead. What this film seemed to understand, and what I think I understand a little better now, just from sitting with it this long, is that there's no villain in that moment. Nobody did anything wrong, and yet something real was lost, even if the only person who felt it was the one being set down. Cinema rarely does this, takes something this small, this undramatic, this completely ordinary, and treats it as worthy of an entire film's attention. Most stories need a bigger wound than this. This one, if I'm right about where it's headed, is built almost entirely around a wound this small. And somehow that makes it feel bigger, not smaller. Because everyone's had this exact tiny nameless loss. Almost nobody's had it shown back to them like this. Would I return to this film? I think the more honest question right now is whether I'm going to go see it at all in the next few days. And the answer is yes, obviously, immediately, probably on opening day. But would I return to it is really a question about whether something holds up on a second look, whether it has enough underneath the surface to reward sitting with it again. And here's the thing, I think I already know the answer, even without having seen it once yet. Because everything we traced in this essay, the light, the silence, Jessie's history quietly humming underneath every scene she's in, that island full of devoted, glowing, unanswered figures, all of that is the kind of thing that doesn't fully register on a first viewing. Not because it's hidden exactly, but because a first viewing is usually busy just feeling things, and noticing things is a different kind of attention. I think this is a film that's going to ask to be watched twice, once to feel it and once to actually see it, and I think both viewings are going to leave something different behind. Here's what I keep returning to more than anything else. This franchise has spent 30 years teaching an entire generation how to say goodbye. Andy giving away his toys, Woody choosing a new life. Both of those were goodbyes, and both of them were beautiful, and both of them made an entire theater cry at the same time, which is its own kind of small miracle. But goodbye isn't only hard thing we have to learn how to do. Some things don't say goodbye, they just quietly become less central, while still being there, still being loved, just differently. And nobody really teaches you how to feel okay about that. There's no ceremony for it, no scored farewell scene, just a slow shift in attention that you only notice afterward if you notice it at all. If this film does what I think it's going to do, it's not teaching kids or the adults sitting next to them how to say goodbye again. It's teaching something quieter and in some ways harder, how to be okay with mattering differently than you used to. How to keep loving something or someone fully even after you've stopped being the most important thing to them. That's not a lesson with a clean ending. There's no scene where that gets resolved because it's not the kind of thing that resolves. It's the kind of thing you just learn to carry. What kind of person do I think will carry this film with them after the credits end? Honestly, I think it's going to be the people who are quietly lived through the thing this film is about without ever having a word for it. The friend who got busy, the hobby that drifted, the version of yourself a few years back who someone outgrew gently without meaning to. If you felt that, really felt it, the specific unglamorous ache of becoming optional to someone or something you still love, I think this film is going to find that feeling in you and hand it back to you wearing a cowgirl hat, and somehow that's going to make it easier to hold. And if you haven't felt that yet, if you are young enough or lucky enough that this particular ache hasn't found you, I think this film might be doing something even more important for you. I think it might be planting something, a way of understanding ahead of time that being loved less urgently isn't the same as being loved less. That the people and things that shape you don't stop mattering just because they stop being the center of your world. If a child watches this film and carries even a fraction of that forward into every friendship, every hobby, every relationship they'll someday quietly grow past without meaning to, that's not a small thing this film will have done. That might be the biggest thing it does. I went into this essay not entirely sure what I'd find, sitting with a film I haven't even seen yet. And I'm walking out of it, out of this sitting, this thinking, this hour we spent together, already a little changed. Not by an ending I don't know yet, by a question I think this film is going to ask that I didn't realize until just now I'd been carrying around unanswered for a long time. So here's where we land, and I want to be honest with you about what kind of landing this actually is. Everything in this essay, every observation, every prediction, every quiet little theory about light and silence and an island full of Buzz Lightyears, all of it was built without having seen the film itself. Which means this final thought isn't really a verdict. It's something more like a snapshot of where I'm standing right before the doors open. Who's going to love this most deeply? I think it's the people who spent 30 years with this franchise without ever quite realizing how much of themselves they'd folded into it. The people for whom Toy Story 3's ending wasn't just a sad scene in a kid's movie, but a moment that quietly rearranged something in them. If this film is doing what it seems to be doing, taking that 30-year history and finally letting Jessie carry it forward into the present, then the people who've been carrying their own version of that history without a place to put it might find this film does something for them that no amount of nostalgia alone could do. And alongside them, I think will be the parents. The ones currently living, right now, inside the exact tension this film is built around, watching a kid's attention drift toward a glowing screen and not knowing whether to feel sad about it or guilty about feeling sad about it or both. If this film gives that feeling somewhere to go that isn't blame, I think it's going to mean something to a lot of people sitting in those seats with their kids beside them who might not connect with it and why. Probably the people walking in wanting this franchise to simply be fun again, uncomplicated, breezy. I returned to a simpler version of these characters before the goodbyes started piling up. There's nothing wrong with wanting that, but if this film is as quietly devastating as everything points toward, that's not the experience it's offering. And there may be some who opt embraced for clean technology is the enemy message and come out unsettled by how generous the film seems to be toward the very thing they expected it to villainize. That generosity is, I think, the film's greatest strength, but it does mean it might not give some viewers the simple catharsis of watching a clear bad guy lose. Cinema, streaming, or something to own. Cinema and honestly opening weekend if you can manage it. Not because the spectacle demands a big screen, though Pixar's visual work always rewards one. It's because of what we talked about back at the very start of this essay, that particular silence that settles over a full theater right before a film begins. If this film is based around stillness, around held faces and quiet recognitions, I think that stillness lands differently, surrounded by other people feeling it with you. This isn't a film I'd want to first experience alone, late at night, on a small screen, with a phone glowing in my other hand. There's something almost too on the nose about that, given everything this film seems to be about. And the rating 6.8 out of 10. Here's the one true sentence that earns it, and it's not really a sentence about the film at all. It's a sentence about me walking in. 6.8 is what it feels like to want very badly to be moved by something, while also knowing that wanting it doesn't make it happen. To hold genuine excitement in one hand and genuine weariness in the other, and to refuse to let either one win before the lights actually go down. Every premiere reaction I've read has been close to rapturous, and maybe they're right, and maybe in a few days I'll be sitting here telling you this number was too cautious. Or maybe the thing that's been described to me, generous, quiet, devastating in the smallest possible ways, turns out to ask more of a film than even a beloved franchise with 30 years of goodwill can deliver. I don't know yet. 6.8 is the number that leaves room for both. It's not a grade, it's a held breath. There are films that ask you to feel something they've already decided you should feel. And then there are films that simply put something true in front of you and trust you to recognize it because you've already lived it in some smaller, quieter version somewhere in your own life. If everything we trace today is right, this is second kind. And those are the only films that ever really stay. Part 13. Until next time. Part 13. Until next time, continuing. Thank you for sitting with this one. Genuinely, essays like this only work because someone on the other side is willing to slow down for an hour and actually think alongside us rather than just waiting for a number at the end. If this is the kind of attention you want more of, the like button helps more than you'd probably guess, and subscribing means you won't miss what's coming next. But more than either of those, I'd love to know what you think in the comments once you've actually seen this film for yourself. A few things I'd genuinely love to hear from you about. First, is there something or someone in your own life that you've quietly become less needed by without it ever being a real goodbye? What did that feel like? And did you ever find a way to make peace with it? Second, once you've seen the film, I want to know whether Jessie's arc lands the way I think it might. Did her history finally feel like it mattered in the present, or did it stay backstory? And third, for the parents watching this with kids beside them, did this film change how you think about the tablet, the screen, the thing competing for your kids' attention tonight? Even a little. Next time we're going somewhere very different, a quieter film, one that almost nobody saw in theaters, but that's been quietly finding its audience ever since, one late night recommendation at a time. If you've ever had a film like that, one that found you rather than the other way around, I think you're going to recognize a lot of yourself in what we talk about next. Until then, take care of yourselves and take care of the things that love you, even after they stop being the thing you need most. That is the sign, Flux. I will see you in the next one.